The room went still. Not just quiet, still, like the silence before a storm or the moment a gunshot echoes in the air and no one knows who's been hit. Eyes shifted, mouths closed. Cameras clicked once, then stopped altogether. A few delegates leaned forward in their seats, their pens frozen in midair. At the center of it all stood a man in simple military dress. No golden ropes, no decorated medals, no unnecessary sparkle. Captain Ibrahim Traore, leader of Burkina Faso, 36 years old, face sharp with purpose, eyes dark with fire. He wasn't reading from paper. He didn't need to. Every word came from a place deeper than memory. "How can this union," he said, voice steady but thundering, "speak of African peace while kneeling to foreign puppeteers who profit from our silence?" The words hit like thunder. One delegate coughed. Another put down his water glass. Traore's voice climbed again. "We celebrate independence on paper while renting out our nations for airbases and blood money. Where is the unity we speak of when Sahelian blood waters the sand, and all we do is issue statements?" No applause, no polite nods, just the kind of hush that tells you someone has just said the thing everyone else was too afraid to say. And then he said it. If the African Union cannot defend the dignity of the Sahel, then the Sahel must defend itself. There was a direct challenge, not just to the AU's authority, but to its very purpose. No more waiting, no more pretending. Traoré had drawn a line. But what pushed this young leader to storm into the African Union like a man with nothing to lose? To answer that, we must go back to the dust, the danger, and the dreams of a place called Burkina Faso. It had been nearly 3 years since Captain Traoré stepped out from the shadows and took power in a country already bleeding. The people were tired of foreign soldiers who promised safety but brought fear, tired of gold mines that filled European pockets while their children starved, tired of being told that help was coming while nothing changed. When Traoré came, it wasn't with empty promises. He arrived in boots, with a gun slung over his shoulder and his heart cracked open by what he had seen. Towns burned by terrorists, families scattered by war, leaders whispering behind closed doors while the people screamed for help. So he did the unthinkable. He seized power in a coup in 2022. Young, untested, and already marked for assassination before he had even taken office. But he didn't flinch. He cut ties with France, Burkina Faso's former colonizer, and told their soldiers to leave. He refused IMF loans. He canceled deals that sold land and resources to companies in London, Paris, and Washington. Instead, he turned east to Russia, to Iran, to nations the West warned against. Not out of loyalty, but out of leverage. "We will no longer beg for scraps from those who stole the table," he said during his first speech as president. Some called him reckless. Others called him a dictator. But many in the Sahel began to call him something else. Hope. Because Traoré wasn't just talking. He launched a plan to reclaim Burkina Faso's gold. He created a state-owned mining company and forced foreign companies to give 15% to the people. He started building the country's first gold refinery to stop exporting raw materials and start building local wealth. And then came the cashew plant. To the outside world, it was just another agricultural project. But to the people of Burkina Faso, it was proof. Proof that something was changing. Every year, Burkina Faso produced almost 2 million tons of cashew apples. The nuts were harvested and exported, but the apple part was thrown away. Wasted. Traoré saw opportunity. His government built an $11.5 million processing plant that turned waste into fuel, actual biofuel that could power engines and even aircraft. The project was run by locals, led by women, and carried no foreign debt, no IMF strings, no World Bank consultants, just innovation born out of hunger and hardship. "We're not exporting nuts," Traoré told a crowd in Ouagadougou. "We're exporting dignity." But that dignity came at a price. Behind the scenes, the threats mounted. Some within his own cabinet began taking calls from foreign embassies. Guns went missing from army depots. Rumors of coups whispered through the streets. One of his closest advisors was found dead in a hotel room. No investigation, no answers. But Traoré didn't back down. He doubled down. He reached out to Mali and Guinea, two other nations tired of foreign meddling, and proposed a bold idea: a Sahelian security alliance, free from ECOWAS and AfricanUnion oversight. An alliance run by Africans for Africans. Some called it dangerous. Others called it war. But Traoré called it survival. So when he walked into that AfricanUnion summit, it wasn't to make friends. It was to issue a warning. A warning that the time for sitting quietly at round tables was over. A warning that the Sahel would no longer die quietly while others sold speeches about peace. And what followed, his speech, his challenge, his raw refusal to bend, was not politics. It was something else, something that changed the room, and maybe, just maybe, the continent itself. The days after that summit were tense. Video clips of Traoré's speech spread like fire, first across West Africa, then beyond. In Bamako, young men watched on cheap phones from barbershops and roadside cafes, nodding silently. In Niamey, students at the university replayed it during study breaks. And back in Ouagadougou, old women in market stalls whispered his words like prayers. But inside the halls of power, the speech wasn't celebrated. It was feared. Several AU leaders were furious, not because they disagreed, but because he had said it out loud. Traoré didn't just challenge the silence, he shattered it. He dared to point fingers in a room full of handshakes. Some called him naive. Others called him a threat. A few behind closed doors called him brave. But none could ignore him. Traoré returned to Burkina Faso not with applause, but with eyes on his back. He knew the road ahead was dangerous. He had called out foreign powers, embarrassed old leaders, and lit a fire under regional unity that had long gone cold. Now the clock was ticking. Back home, he moved fast. His first mission, security. Burkina Faso had long relied on foreign troops to fight off extremists who roamed the northern deserts. French bases had dotted the country for years, offering help that always seemed to arrive too late. Traoré shut them down. Then he announced the launch of Project Rebirth, a secretive program involving engineers, veterans, and civilian militias. The goal? Build local weapons, train regional forces, control their own defense. We will no longer wait for NATO's leftovers, he said at the project's first closed-door briefing. The heart of it was innovation. They started developing surveillance drones, satellite trackers, and ground units, simple but smart, built by local minds using limited tools. It wasn't glamorous, but it was theirs. And across the Sahel, something began to shift. Mali answered the call. So did Guinea. Then came whispers from Chad, whispers from Niger. These nations weren't signing treaties or making speeches. They were sending trucks, engineers, maps. The idea of a Sahel security bloc was no longer a fantasy. It was forming quietly in the shadows. A defense alliance not run by ECOWAS, not funded by Europe, not managed by the UN, just Africans building their own shield. But that shield drew attention. French officials warned of destabilization. The US sent quiet envoys urging Traoré to reconsider radical isolation. Some AU delegates began pushing for sanctions, claiming Burkina Faso was endangering regional order. But Traoré didn't flinch. He held a press briefing and said simply, "Let them sanctioneer." And the crowd erupted. Because for the first time in decades, a leader wasn't speaking from a podium of permission. He was speaking from the soil, with the dust of his people still on his boots. But it wasn't just bullets and bases. Traoré had another front in this fight, the economy. He knew that without wealth in the people's hands, everything else would fall. So he declared war on poverty, on extraction, on old trade systems. He started small but smart. The cashew revolution was only the beginning. He expanded it: shea butter, mango waste, baobab fruit. Processing plants popped up across the countryside, powered by local workers, built from local materials. Each plant wasn't just about profit. It was about proof. Proof that Burkina Faso didn't need to export raw dreams. They could build, bottle, and brand their own future. In one plant, the cashew shell liquid, once burned and discarded, was now fueling generators. In another, women-led teams were designing low-cost bio-stoves using fruit pulp. The numbers were small. The impact was massive, because in every home that switched on a light without foreign fuel, a story was being told. We can do this ourselves. But it was the next idea that turned heads even further. Traoré stood before a group of farmers, engineers, and elders one dusty afternoon and unveiled what he called the Burkina Corridor, a plan to connect landlocked nations through rail, trade, and tech. A manufacturing line across West Africa, starting with textiles, moving to electronics, and eventually to machinery. Not funded by the World Bank, not brokered by Europe, a network funded by the people it would serve. Delegates laughed when they first heard it, but Traoré only smiled. Every revolution starts as a joke, he said, until it doesn't. And the youth listened. From young farmers using solar pumps in the Sahel to student coders in Ouagadougou building security apps, they began calling it the Burkina model. A model not based on GDP charts, but on clean water, safe villages, and jobs that meant something. But the higher he climbed, the more they tried to pull him down. Within his government, tensions simmered. A few ministers began to disappear during meetings, only to return with new wealth and vague explanations. One night, his motorcade was rerouted. No one claimed responsibility. A week later, a junior officer was caught carrying coded maps. The walls were closing in, but Traoré stayed focused. In one late-night meeting with his generals, he laid it out clearly. If they kill me, he said, they'll just kill a man. But these ideas, they've already taken root. Ideas don't bleed. They grow. He was wrong. From the dusty markets of Kaya to the university halls in Bamako, the words had already spread. And now, the question was no longer if the Sahel would change. It was how far it would go. It started as whispers in village courtyards. Then it rolled through university halls. Then it shook the very foundation of the African Union. Across West Africa, people had a new question on their lips. What if Traoré is right? What if the way things had always been was the problem itself? What if begging for aid, accepting empty promises, and sending raw gold to Europe in exchange for debt? What if that was the real betrayal? Burkina Faso, once seen as a poor, landlocked country forgotten by the world, was suddenly the most talked about nation on the continent. Not for chaos, not for war, for standing up, for building, for fighting with brains, not just bullets. And all of it started to converge in one place, a dusty strip of desert land near the Niger border where a secret gathering was underway. It wasn't a summit. There were no microphones, no shiny banners, no news cameras. But there were generals from Mali, ministers from Guinea, engineers from Chad, tribal elders, young hackers, farmers. Traoré was there too, sitting on a wooden stool under a canvas tent. He didn't speak first. He listened. For 5 hours. Listened to stories of French drone strikes gone wrong, of UN trucks driving past villages with no water, of sons taken by terrorists while Western media painted it all as unrest. And then he stood. No one is coming to save us, he said. But maybe that's our blessing. And with that, the Sahel Alliance was born. An unofficial pact for now, but one with real consequences. A new intelligence network was established, not through satellites, but through shared boots on the ground. Communication channels were set up between local forces across borders. Smugglers were tracked. Arms deals were intercepted. Suddenly, attacks on villages dropped. The insurgents didn't vanish, but they scattered. For the first time, they were being hunted by people who knew the terrain and had nothing left to lose. But while hope rose in the Sahel, pressure built outside of it. In Addis Ababa, the AU's inner circle was growing restless. Some warned that Traoré was dividing the union. Others feared his example would spread. And they were right. In Senegal, students marched demanding a local version of the Burkina model. In Ghana, radio hosts asked why gold mines paid more in Europe than to the villages they stood on. Even in South Africa, a few parliament members brought up Traoré's speech in heated debates. The revolution wasn't in uniforms, it was in minds. Still, the threats were real. One night, a convoy in northern Burkina Faso was hit. Not by rebels, but by a drone. not one of theirs. There was no official statement, no proof. But the message was clear. Someone was watching. Traoré didn't flinch. In fact, he moved faster. He pushed for deeper cooperation with Mali and Guinea, signing a security coordination deal that allowed rapid joint responses without ECOWAS approval. He opened the country's first military tech school, inviting students from across the Sahel to train, build, and deploy tools that were once imported with red tape and dependency. He launched a food independence initiative, using local seed banks, old farming techniques, and solar irrigation to break the country's reliance on foreign grain shipments. Bit by bit, piece by piece, Burkina Faso was becoming something rare, a country that didn't wait for permission to live. But Traoré knew the most powerful force wasn't gold, or fuel, or even weapons. It was youth. He ended his final speech of the year not at a government event, but in a dusty field outside Ouagadougou, where thousands of young people gathered under the setting sun. "They call us rebels," he said, eyes scanning the crowd. "But we're only rejecting chains." The crowd roared. He spoke of dignity, not the kind written in constitutions, but the kind that lives in the eyes of a child who drinks clean water for the first time. He spoke of sovereignty, not as isolation, but as choice. The choice to trade with your neighbor before begging from your colonizer. The choice to build factories instead of pipelines for other people's oil. He spoke of love, not the soft kind, but the fierce, angry love that makes people march through bullets to take back what was stolen. "They may try to silence me," he said, "but ideas, they don't bleed. They grow." And in that moment, everyone understood something. This wasn't just Burkina Faso's fight anymore. It was a call to every African who had ever been told they were too poor, too small, too late. Traoré had sparked something. In the days that followed, the AU scheduled an emergency meeting to discuss rising threats to regional stability. Delegates whispered about suspensions, about pressure from Europe, about consequences. But no matter what they did, it was too late. The fire was already burning. In the alleys, in the classrooms, in the mines, across the Sahel, across Africa, people were waking up. And whether they agreed with Traoré or not, one truth had settled into the bones of the continent. Africa was no longer begging for space at someone else's table. It was building its own. The question now wasn't if others would join. It was whether they'd be brave enough to stand up when they did. The silence in that AU room, that was the sound of something breaking and something far bigger beginning.